Everyone thinks John Lennon and Paul McCartney spent their final years in a bitter, silent war. But their very last conversation wasn't an insult or a legal threat. It was a message so brutally honest that it changed Paul's life forever, and most fans have no idea it even happened. We have all been fed a very specific narrative about the aftermath of the biggest band in music history. The story usually goes that, when the 1960s crashed to a halt, so did the friendship that defined a generation. We picture John Lennon sitting at a white piano, venomously penning the lyrics to How Do You Sleep, a track so dripping with contempt that it seemed to permanently sever any tie he ever had to his former songwriting partner. We imagine Paul McCartney retreating to his farm in Scotland, broken and resentful, filing a massive lawsuit against the other 3 members of the band just to escape the financial ruin of their crumbling empire. For decades, the media capitalized on this exact imagery. It was the ultimate rock and roll tragedy. The 2 greatest musical geniuses of the 20th century, locked in a Cold War that would last until the day John died. But human relationships, especially ones forged in the crucible of unprecedented global fame, are never that simple. They do not just switch off overnight. To truly understand the gravity of John's final words to Paul, we have to look past the tabloid headlines and dive into the quiet, invisible moments of the 1970s. During those 10 years, the public thought they were sworn enemies, but behind closed doors, a completely different story was unfolding. It was a story of 2 men desperately trying to figure out how to be just ordinary friends after spending their entire adult lives as mythological figures. In the years immediately following the split, the wounds were undeniably raw. Paul was devastated by John's departure, and John was fiercely protective of his new life and his artistic independence. Their communication was often reduced to sniping through song lyrics and nasty letters published in music magazines. When Paul released his album Ram, it included subtle lyrical jabs directed at John and Yoko. John, never one to let a slight go unanswered, retaliated with a sledgehammer. The track How Do You Sleep was a total character assassination, essentially calling Paul a sellout whose music was merely music. If you were a fan reading the music press in 1971, you would be entirely justified in believing that these 2 men would never speak again. But what the public did not see was the underlying foundation of brotherhood that simply refused to completely erode. As the decade wore on, the fiery anger began to burn itself out, replaced by a much more complicated mix of nostalgia, regret, and lingering affection. There were secret meetings. There were late-night phone calls that started out tense, but ended in genuine laughter. In 1974, during John's infamous Lost Weekend period in Los Angeles, Paul actually dropped by the studio. They even jammed together, a chaotic and messy recording session that stands as the only time they played music together after the breakup. And then, of course, there was that legendary night in 1976, when Paul was visiting John at his apartment in the Dakota in New York City. They were watching Saturday Night Live, and Lorne Michaels appeared on screen offering a ridiculously small sum of money for the Beatles to reunite on the show. For a brief, shining moment, John and Paul seriously considered getting in a cab and heading down to the studio just for the joke. They were laughing. They were hanging out. They were simply John and Paul again. But right here is where the narrative takes a dark, almost unbelievable turn. Because just as it seemed they had finally navigated the minefield of their past and found a comfortable rhythm, a massive, suffocating wall was suddenly built between them. You see, by the late 1970s, reaching John Lennon became almost physically impossible. He had retreated deep into domestic life, and access to him was heavily guarded by his inner circle. Paul would call the Dakota, only to be intercepted and turned away by gatekeepers. Old friends were once again separated, not by their own anger, but by an impenetrable fortress of isolation and bizarre paranoia surrounding John's estate. If you think the tragedy of their relationship was a fiery feud, you're completely wrong. The real tragedy is that right when they were finally ready to truly heal and embrace each other, the world, and the management around them, tried to lock them out of each other's lives entirely. But Paul absolutely refused to give up on his best friend. Paul McCartney understood John Lennon better than anyone else on the planet. He knew that beneath the acerbic wit, the tough guy exterior from Liverpool, and the radical political posturing, John was deeply insecure and intensely sentimental. Paul knew he just had to keep trying to break through that fortress. By 1980, John had settled into his role as a house husband. He was baking bread, raising his young son Sean, and finding a sense of peace that had eluded him for his entire adult life. The manic energy of the Beatlemania years and the destructive chaos of his early solo career had finally faded. And it was in this tranquil, domestic setting that the final, fateful conversations between the two men took place. Paul managed to get through to the Dakota, and instead of the fraught, tense negotiations of the past, their conversations became remarkably ordinary. They did not talk about massive reunion tour. They did not talk about the lawsuits that had plagued their past. They did not argue over songwriting credits or the legacy of their band. Instead, they talked about the most mundane, beautiful things you could possibly imagine. They talked about baking bread. They talked about raising kids. They talked about their cats. It was the conversation of two middle-aged fathers who had survived a chaotic war and just wanted to compare notes on the quiet life. For Paul, this was a massive revelation. It was a profound relief to hear the softness in John's voice. The competitive edge that had defined their relationship for so long had been entirely replaced by a genuine, relaxed warmth. But there was still a lingering, unspoken weight between them. The elephant in the room was always the sheer magnitude of what they had meant to each other, and how perilously close they had come to losing it forever. They were two men who had changed the entire world together, yet for a decade, they had barely known how to exist in the same room. This brings us directly to their final phone call in late 1980, shortly before the senseless tragedy of December 8th. It was a call that wrapped up like any other friendly chat, but as they were saying their goodbyes, John delivered a line that would echo in Paul's mind for the rest of his life. It was a message so simple, yet so brutally honest, that it completely shattered the remaining facade of their complex rivalry. John said, "Think about me every now and then, old friend." That was it. Think about me every now and then, old friend. Why is this phrase so brutal? It is brutal because of its staggering vulnerability. John Lennon, the man who sang I Am the Walrus, the man who challenged presidents and led anti-war movements, the man who projected an aura of absolute invincibility to the press, was laying his heart completely bare. He was asking for reassurance. He was acknowledging the extreme fragility of their bond and pleading not to be forgotten by the one person who truly knew him before the fame, before the money, and before the madness. For Paul, those words were a quiet validation of everything they had ever shared. But when John was murdered just weeks later, that simple request transformed from a sweet sign-off into a devastating final directive. It became a hauntingly beautiful epitaph for the greatest songwriting partnership in human history. The brutality lies in the fact that Paul would now have to spend the rest of his life doing exactly what John asked, but without John there to share the memories. Paul was left completely alone to carry the immense weight of their shared history, constantly reminded of the friend he had just gotten back, only to lose him permanently in the most violent way imaginable. To truly grasp the emotional gravity of those final words, we have to look at what happened a few months after John's death. In 1981, Paul McCartney was in the Caribbean, specifically on the island of Montserrat, recording his album Tug of War. He was still drowning in profound grief, struggling to process the sudden and horrific loss of his brother in arms. Joining him in the studio was the legendary rockabilly pioneer Carl Perkins, a massive hero to both Paul and John from their early teenage days in Liverpool. Carl Perkins had written a song during his time on the island, totally unaware of the final conversation Paul and John had shared. After a recording session, Carl sat down and played this acoustic new song for Paul. The song was called My Old Friend. As Carl sang the lyrics, Paul listened intently. But when Carl reached the end of the song, he sang a specific line that caused Paul to physically collapse in tears, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotion. Paul had to literally leave the room, sobbing uncontrollably. The line Carl Perkins had written, completely by coincidence, or perhaps through some cosmic, unexplainable connection, was, "Think about me every now and then, old friend." Paul's wife, Linda McCartney, wrapped her arms around Carl and explained to the bewildered musician that those were the exact last words John had ever spoken to Paul. It was a moment of sheer, devastating serendipity. It proved just how deeply those words had embedded themselves into Paul's soul. He took John's final request to heart and channeled that unbearable sorrow into his own music. Shortly after, Paul wrote and recorded the song Here Today, a masterpiece of raw emotion designed as an open letter to John. In it, Paul finally says the things he never got the chance to say while John was alive, directly addressing the love and the tears they shared. Imagine the psychological burden of mourning someone the entire world thinks you despise. When the news of John's death broke, the media immediately shoved microphones into Paul's face, demanding a profound statement about a man they had spent a decade insisting he hated. Paul, in a state of deep shock and protective numbness, infamously muttered, "It is a drag." The press instantly crucified him for it, labeling him callous, jealous, and unfeeling. But what the cameras could not capture, and what the headlines completely missed, was the private comfort Paul carried within himself. He knew the absolute truth. He did not need to perform his grief for an audience because he knew exactly where he and John stood at the very end. He had the quiet, unbreakable armor of those final words. "Think about me every now and then, old friend." He knew that the bitter narrative sold by the press was a total illusion, a convenient drama manufactured for public consumption and record sales. The reality was a quiet phone call between two dads, talking about baking bread and acknowledging a lifetime of shared affection. This stark contrast between the public spectacle of their feud and the intimate, domestic reality of their reconciliation is exactly why we remain so completely fascinated by them. It strips away the mythology of the untouchable rock star and reveals the highly vulnerable human beings underneath. It shows us that even the most monumental, historically significant relationships are ultimately bound by the same fragile threads of forgiveness, communication, and basic human love that govern the rest of us. The story of John and Paul's final conversation completely shatters the myth of the silent war. It is a powerful reminder that the media narratives we accept as absolute historical facts are often wildly inaccurate, obscuring the deeply personal truths that lie just beneath the surface. John's brutal vulnerability and Paul's quiet, enduring grief transform the ultimate rock and roll tragedy into a deeply moving story of redemption and brotherhood. They found their way back to each other, not on a massive stage in front of millions of screaming fans, but in the quiet, mundane moments of ordinary life. So the next time you hear a Beatles song, do not think about the lawsuits, the angry letters, or the sensationalized feud. Think about two old friends, sharing a laugh across the Atlantic, completely unaware that they were speaking for the very last time. And if you want to discover the real reason why they stopped touring in the first place, and the terrifying backstage incident that forced them off the road forever, you will want to click the video on your screen right now. I will see you there.